Gentlemen, you have to give me some mosquito beating my foot here by. Am I there? Shaking, shaking.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to this edition of Globespan, more specifically, the edition of Globespan where we speak on matters related to economic development and matters related to the broader economy. My name is Richard Rambarran. I'll be your host this evening for this program. Of course, by now I'm no stranger to you all. Hosted several editions of this. It's the first time I believe that I am hosting this program with Mr. Joel Bhagwandin on it. So, Joel, a formal welcome to Globespan's platform this evening. And it, of course, is a pleasure having you here in your capacity as a financial analyst in Guyana. So, thank you very much for joining us and, of course, accepting the invitation. The additional person here on the panel this evening is Mr. Timothy Jonas. I believe by now Timothy needs no introduction to the Guyanese public and to the, especially you, the Globespan audience, given that he is on this program with a high degree of frequency. So, good evening, all. This evening, we will be speaking on a matter which is transformative within the Guyanese context, and of course, something which certainly should bring or ought to bring broad benefits to the Guyanese public. This is none other than the Gas to Shore project. Now, what exactly is the Gas to Shore project is a matter, of course, where we'll dive into some detail this evening. But just in a cursory way, let me give a bit of an explanation as to what we are talking about when we speak about this Gas to Shore project. Now, ExxonMobil, of course, as we are well aware, has declared that there are more than 8 billion barrels of recoverable oil uh, out in the ultra deep waters of Guyana or offshore Guyana. Now, from this process of drilling and extracting oil from subsea, what is present is also a large quantum of natural gas. Now, natural gas, of course, is an energy source which you would want to say, quote unquote, is a byproduct of the drilling of the oil. So that is why when we speak about the oil sector, we usually say the oil and gas sector, because gas is usually one of the types of products that come about as a result of the drilling of oil. So we have heard a variety of estimates, but it is something which is commercially feasible from what we have been made to understand by the experts, the amount of natural gas that there is out there. Currently, you of course have seen a number of discussions in the newspaper and in the public domain regarding the project where it is being proposed to pipe natural gas onshore to Guyana. Now, the intention of this project is to ensure that the energy which is created from the or which is stored in the natural gas can materialize into benefits for the Guyanese people by piping that gas onshore and then transforming it into a form where electricity can be produced or power can be produced from this natural gas. So, of course, with a project of this nature, with a project of this magnitude, you are looking at something which can be potentially transformative for the economy. Now, uh, given that, it is my pleasure to introduce, it's my pleasure, of course, to introduce the topic here and ask the gentlemen who are with me on this panel to share their opinion on what's happening. I am aware that Mr. Bhagwandin has written quite extensively about this project in response to those in the public domain who have criticized the project. So I just want to perhaps start this evening's session off from our panelists by hearing from Mr. Jonas on, firstly, Timothy, what do you think about this project? And what are some of the expected benefits that you look forward to from the project as a citizen of Ghana?
So, look for a benefit, you got to identify the problems that we have. We pay too much for electricity. Our electricity supply is unreliable, unstable. We have had decades of problems, decades of decline, and that needs to be fixed. I see that people who the people who are proponents of the idea also sell the gas aspect as a cooking gas possibility. Now, quite frankly, I don't know enough about that to comment on it. I know something about that business, how the business is run, the distribution, and that kind of thing. I'd like to see figures in terms of cost, what it will cost to evolve the industry to accommodate this new method of supply, manufacture, and bottling. But I think that I have always held the view that the government should not be running a business. So if this is feasible, if this is commercially viable, then private investor got to make it so, got to prove it. I always have a problem with a proposal that involves government borrowing money or using taxpayers' money to fund a commercial venture. Hard experience has taught us it doesn't. That is my one reservation. I have seen projections, I've seen figures. Some questions may arise, that's all well and good. But one thing I would mark on immediately is that it should not be a government venture. It should certainly the government can lay the framework and facilitate it, whatever grants of licenses, whatever concessions and that kind of thing. But it needs the expertise, the experience, the business savvy, and the capital of a private venture and a private investor.
Right. Thank you very much for your comments in that regard. I just one thing, could we have the microphones muted if we're not doing this? So thank you very much. Now, we have had some criticisms in the public domain being leveled against this project. And of course, we have had some rebuttals or counteractions to these criticisms. I know in particular, we have had some folks from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis and such like, but we'll get into those criticisms a bit more of the project a bit later on. What I'll do at this time, I'll ask Joel to give his opinion of what the Gas to Shore project is and overall, what does he think about it from both a financial as well as an economic perspective.
All right. Thank you, Richard. First of all, thank you to Globespan for having me here. While it's my first time sharing a panel with Timothy and yourself, Richard, on this forum, I am no stranger to Globespan. I've been on Globespan since pre-elections with some of our other colleagues. So I've been missing in action for quite a long time since the elections, and now I'm back in the new year for the first time since then. So thank you again for having me. In response to your question, Richard, as you would have acknowledged in your introduction, I would have written extensively, particularly on the Gas to Shore project. And I feel compelled to do a little presentation on the work that I've done so far. So if you would permit me to bring up that, to make that presentation. Um, I am also, you made reference to the Institute of Energy Economics, and they would have pronounced in other sections of the local media that the gas to shore project is a recipe for bankruptcy and things like that. And I'm actually one of the author, perhaps the only author, who would have taken them on in a very fronted manner, or using your word earlier, in a very aggressive manner. And I will tell you why in the presentation I did that. And that is because they have ignored completely the development context of Guyana, which I don't believe they understand the development context of Guyana. And secondly, I have a strong issue or a strong problem with these so-called foreign experts coming to Guyana, pronouncing on our economic affairs, and Guyanese propagated by media houses, and Guyanese take it as gospel. Why can't Guyanese professionals like yourselves and the University of Guyana has a whole batch of economic students. The University of Guyana has an energy think tank. These are the people, local stakeholders should be driving these discussions and debates. We don't need foreign experts to come and tell us about economic affairs. So let's get right into the presentation. If could the technician bring up the screen for us, please? Right. So in response to the critiques of the gas to shore project, I would have embarked upon what I call a contextual economic and financial analysis of the gas to shore project. Now, it is called a contextual analysis for two reasons. That is, one, the context, the broad context in which this analysis was done is in the context of Guyana's development, our development context. That is, and that has three aspects. We're talking about Guyana's development, Guyana's historic development context, Guyana's peculiar development challenges, and Guyana's development trajectory. All right? Then the second reason why it's called a contextual analysis is because the techniques that I would have employed to conduct this analysis is a combination of what is called scenario analysis and extrapolatory techniques. That is because of the limitations of the analysis of itself. And the limitations are the lack of the kind of data that you would need, particularly the official data. The estimates used here are not, we don't know what is the official, what is going to be the actual cost of the project. So we assume what the cost would be, and we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. And I did not talk about the environmental impact, and that is because, for two reasons again. The official work of the government, what we know so far is that since the government assumed office, they would have put together a task force, a gas to shore task force, to deal with the implementation of the project. And that task force will, of course, as part of its work, will be dealing with the environmental impact and so forth. And so, of course, the lack of data to do that kind of analysis as well, I don't have access to it. So that is why the analysis does not consider the environmental impact, but provided that the environmental risks there is scope for mitigation and minimize the risk. Then you have to consider as well, logically, Guyana will not be the first country to have gas pipes running under the river. So in pursuing sustainable development, there are always solutions to every problem, especially in this era of technology and innovation. So that's why, for those reasons, the study did not talk about the environmental impact, because of the official work will, of course, take that into consideration. So having said that, let me tell you first what would be the structure of the presentation for the benefit of the audience or the viewership. So we'll talk about the background of the contextual analysis, which I already talked about. We'll talk about the limitations and the methodology of the analysis, which I also just talked about. And then the next thing we will get right into is a summary of the financial analysis at the underlying assumptions. Then we would look at the summary of the economic and development impact of the gas to shore project. And then we're going to talk about Guyana's development context, as I referred to earlier, the historic development context, Guyana's peculiar development challenges and the development trajectory. And then I would conclude the presentation. So let's get into a summary of the financial analysis. So in the introduction, I said we don't know what is the actual cost. So in my analysis, I estimated that it would cost 400 million. So let me tell you quickly how I come up with 400 million. The reason I come up with 400 million, because the same media house that propagate the guys like Tom Sanzillo and so on would have in 2018 reported that, made reference to some feasibility study under the previous government, that the project would cost about 300 million US. Now, I don't know how authentic is that number. So that was the basis which I used to come up with 400 million. If they're estimating 300, so let me work with 400 million. And so from this first scenario, where we calculated what would be the revenue generated. Now, how did I arrive at 125 million US in a year? From looking at the Guyana Power and Light strategic report of 2016,
Joe, could I
which shows
interrupt you
a
a second?
forecast. Yeah, go ahead.
Your cost of the project is 400 million. What do we get for 400 million? What is obtained for 400 million?
This is both, well, I'm assuming here 400 would be the full cost to run the pipe as well as build the onshore facility, because what we have an understanding of is that Exxon, who is the partner in this project, would finance a portion of the cost, which I believe is running the pipes. The government would have to foot the cost for the onshore
I understand
infrastructure.
that your concept has Exxon participating. Running the pipes and building the onshore facility, where I'm vague is what the onshore facility is. Is it a generation facility or is it something else?
But that is what we don't know. So that is what we don't know, which is one of the limitations of the study. But let's assume all things being equal, we're talking about 400 million. But when we look at these numbers, you would also see that even if it costs 700 million or 500 million, you will still get a positive net present value for the project, right? So without making the analysis too complex or too much scenarios, I use one figure, but from the findings of that one figure, the results of that one figure, one can deduce that if the cost is 500 million for everything, or if it's 700 million, it will still be profitable from a financial perspective based on these assumptions, of course. Now let's talk of how we derive the revenue. Our current annual consumption of electricity in terms of megawatts of power is just about 1 billion annually. And GPL in 2016 forecast that annual growth in demand would grow about 5%. Now that's organic growth, which was included in this analysis. Now, taking into consideration at the time in which that forecast was done of 5% annual growth, during that time, the country had no ambitious development plan. The country had no transformational projects because, of course, 2016 was under the previous administration, and there were no, in 5 years, there was no major development project other than projects like the Urban Park and a few arches and a few overhead, pedestrian overhead and a roundabout somewhere, right? There were no major development. So from looking at the development trajectory and the transformational projects, and I'm going to explain a little bit in terms of what transformational transforming the economic landscape means, then we can assume that.
Let me interrupt you if you don't mind. And because you're doing a presentation,
No,
I
go
know
ahead.
people are listening. I am playing their part if you don't mind in asking questions. So you're talking about annual growth, and I'm not going to politicize this and deal with your statement about no projects. What in the past, but you are anticipating growth because there will be projects in the future. What projects do you have in mind that are on stream or in the pipeline, forgive my use of the expression, that will justify a projection of growth that you're talking about?
Now, Timothy, the question, all the answers to those questions would come out in the presentation if you allow me, but I'll take them as you ask. Now, when we talk about, because if I got to pause to answer the question, I'm going to divert to other parts of the presentation, which I would eventually deal with, but I'll jump on it as you ask the question. When we talk about development, right?
Joel, let me just, because of the nature of what you're doing, I'll ask two things. One, that you be as succinct as possible, and two, that you try not to get into extremely technical details regarding on
No,
the
we can do a summary. No, we can just do the summary. No, I won't get
Would
too
it be
technical,
easier
Richard. Don't
if I
worry.
wait till you finish? I can wait till you finish. I don't mind.
Yeah. So
Yes,
also,
it will.
Okay,
Timothy,
will do. Will do.
let's just allow Joel to complete his presentation. Maybe give him about 10 minutes more at maximum. And let
Yes,
him complete
10
the
minutes is
presentation, and
suffice,
then
Richard. 10 minutes.
perhaps we can jot the questions down as we go.
Yeah, 10 minutes. 10 minutes is suffice, right? So let me run through the financial numbers quickly without getting too technical. So we're projecting that in we have three scenarios of demand forecasts, and we project that you have energy could grow by 10% in one scenario, 5% being the organic level, 10% being moderate, and 15% being the highest it could grow. With those assumptions, given the development trajectory, which we're going to talk about, you have the country's demand could grow by the end of the next decade by at least 2.6 million megawatts of power, or about 2 million megawatts of power. All right, now we're going to talk about the underlying assumptions for these here. So I'm going to be mindful of Richard and not get too technical, but the result of all three analysis, using those with the objective that the government want to reduce energy costs by 50% or more, you could arrive at a net operating profit of about $100 million. So if you want to know when you could recover the investment, the recovery period for the investment in itself, let's say it's 400 million, could be recovered in about 7 years. If it's 5 or 700 million, it could be recovered within 10 to 15 years. Now that's what the numbers show. All right, based on those assumptions. Now let's get into a summary of let's talk a little bit of the financing model. And Timothy talked in his introduction, he's concerned that government shouldn't get in the business of running enterprises. Now, one of the models that could be pursued is called we could set up a project financing model where a special purpose vehicle could be established. The government could opt to hold, whether they want to hold 15% equity or 20% equity, and the difference could be financed from the private sector, from private investors. Of course, we know Exxon is a partner. So with that model, where you can have a financing model of a combination of debt and equity instruments, with the government just holding 15 or 20%, that minimizes the financing risk on the part of the government and makes the project more attractive as well. So let's go quickly now into the potential economic benefits, because I want to spend some time, Richard, perhaps 5 minutes, on the development context, which is the broad context in which this analysis was done. So let's go through quickly the economic benefits. Now, we know that the implementation of the gas to shore project will become a major part of Guyana's energy mix, and that can result in more than 50% savings on fuel imports, which is currently over 500 million. So we could save about 200 million in imports for fuel alone. This can ultimately translate to the country enjoying a trade balance surplus from a deficit position as it has always been. A trade balance surplus is a signal of stronger macroeconomic stability and strong and stable domestic currency. Lower energy costs can drive a strong industrialized economy and attract more foreign direct investments. Currently, energy costs 40 or 50% of the energy costs accounts for about 40 to 50% of the operating costs of manufacturing firms. Therefore, lower energy costs can facilitate greater economies of scale and economies of scope and overall national competitiveness. This means manufacturers can become more competitive globally by producing at a cheaper rate. This means we could produce more value-added goods. Given the country's development trajectory under the current regime with massive infrastructural projects and the objective to reduce energy costs by 50% or more, we talk about the energy demand forecast earlier, how that could grow. Energy demand is expected to be driven heavily by industrial and commercial activities owing to lower energy costs as well as increase in the number of households. So the target of the government is 50,000 new households in the next 5 years. So development projects such as those could help to drive the demand, as Timothy was asking. You're targeting about 5 to 10,000 new homes a year. That's about $75 billion injected into the economy. Then you got to consider that will trickle down to increased loans in the banking sector, which will also drive demand in other sectors as the construction and hardware suppliers, contractors, home builders, thus creation of thousands of jobs. Over the next 10 to 5 years, the estimated total public and private investment in major infrastructure developmental projects can amount to $7.2 trillion or $700 billion a year. I'm not going to get more technical into this. The summary of the analysis, Richard, is that the economic benefits could translate to national competitiveness. It could drive industrialization. It could drive more commercial activities. Now let's talk about some of the projects that Timothy were asking for. And these projects are long-term projects. We're talking about a new bridge across the Demerara River. We're talking about the housing drive of 50,000 new homes. We're talking about the Guyana-Suriname bridge across the Berbice River. We're talking about the Guyana-Brazil road link. We're talking about the East Coast Bypass Road. We're talking about private hotel development, at least 5 new hotels. We're talking about shore-based facilities. You're talking about Deepwater Harbor, the Demerara Bridge, state-of-the-art hospital, 4-lane highway from Georgetown to Chideri, 2,000 miles of hinterland road. And then you have other private investments, some that were announced, which was referenced, like, for example, the Mahaika Oceanfront Golf Club. You have the Gateway Luxury Community Essequibo. And this is only the start of 2021. So all of these projects are public investment projects, government projects, of course, which could be financed through public-private partnerships. We haven't talked about private investments as yet, because a lot of the private investments in these countries are driven by family-owned businesses. So the summary of the economic and financial analysis concludes that, based on the assumptions used, it could be a profitable venture, and these are the economic benefits it could lead to. It could lead to more investments. More private investments mean the government could collect more taxes in revenue. And it even shows that with an expansionary fiscal policy, meaning lower taxation, encouraging private investments, you can have government organic revenue growing by as much as more than $100 billion, which is its current average is $200 billion. Now, why I make mention of that is because the proponents who have a contrary view of this whole project are taking that view from the perspective that Guyana relies only on oil revenues, which is not true. Guyana does not only rely on oil revenues, and so the entire project the entire scope of the project in terms of financing it, right, would lead to expanding your organic revenue base for the government in the form of taxation, corporate taxation, more private investments, more foreign direct investments. Your government revenue from taxation would also increase. So the oil revenue is just an extra. It's just a bonus. Now let's talk about the development context, which is the most important part. And Richard, give me another 5 minutes to dwell a bit on this. All these projects, importantly, all these projects, transformational projects that we call them, bridge across the Demerara River, bridge across Berbice, road link in Latam, these are not new projects. These projects were conceptualized in a national development strategy that was developed by this current government in its previous life in 1994 under President Jagat, right? That national development strategy was developed and completed in 1996. It took 2 years before it was completed and approved. Now, let's talk a little bit about this. Who built this strategy? This strategy was developed by more than 200 Guyanese stakeholders. More than 200 Guyanese stakeholders, which includes professionals like ourselves, which includes stakeholders from the private sector, which include stakeholders from civil society and all across Guyana, representing the whole of Guyana. 200. Contrast that with the Green State Development Strategy, and permit me, I must make this comparison. The Green State Development Strategy, as I've said to many, is not a strategy. It's not even a development strategy. If you study the Green State Development Strategy, it is a cut and paste exercise, because I've studied all the strategies in this country. And when you look at the GSDS, a consultant, an intern from the United Nations came to this country and sat in a room, and he went through the National Development Strategy. He cut parts from it and put it in. He cut parts from the Low Carbon Development Strategy and put it in. He cut parts from the National Competitive Strategy, which was also developed by this government in its previous life, and put it in, and some other fluff from the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And that was called a National Development Strategy, Green State. That is not a strategy. Compare and contrast that with how the National Development Strategy was developed in 1996. Now let's talk about the implementation of that strategy. If you do a simple exercise and look at all the national budgets from 1997 to 2014, you would see that that National Development Strategy of 1996 was implemented incrementally through every single budget of 1996, every single budget. And so this brings me to our peculiar development challenge. And let me just quote a few of the projects in that strategy to show you what I mean. The strategy, for example, since 1996.
Joel, just when you're done with that, just kindly wrap up so that we can move ahead.
Yeah, we're wrapping up. This is important. Allow me, please. Allow me. Give me wrapping up. Right. Since 1996, this strategy identified that we need a new bridge across the Demerara River, a new bridge across the reason why this development strategy was stymied for so many years, it is because of political instability. From 1996 to now, there has been, and this is documented in our history and recent history, different periods of political instability described, which can be characterized as politically motivated crime and violence and ethnic division. We were recently reminded of what occurred in 1997, for example. Recently in 2020, we saw history was almost repeating itself. And so we don't need to get into the details of that. But let me give you the more recent example. In 2011, when we had a new political dispensation for the first time with a minority government and a majority, the opposition control the parliament with a one-seat majority, development was also stymied. So we development wasn't stymied only for 5 years, for 10 years, more than 10 years. We would have already have hydro project. We would have already have the state-of-the-art hospital. We would have already have the bridge across the Demerara River. We would have already had the road, the bypass road cutting East Coast. So this is important. When we speak about development and the economic feasibility of the project, we have to understand our development context, historically, the peculiar challenges, and the trajectory. This is the broad context of this study. And hence, now that we have come out of that, we are in a period of high confidence. Guyana's geopolitical importance now is growing. We now need to look at Guyana's development from a broader spectrum. We now need to look at Guyana's development from a position of leading regional integration and South-South cooperation. And so as a result of that, we can now look at Guyana's development trajectory. And this is why when the president speaks and talks about inclusive governance and the importance of Guyana uniting as a people, if we do not do that, then we are going to have periods of instability again, and our development is going to stymie. Can we afford that? The answer is no. The answer is simply no. And Richard, I hereby submit my case. I think we lost Jonas.
I think we lost Timothy there, which is unfortunate because I actually wanted Timothy to come in at this point, because I know that he had a number of questions for you.
Oh, he's back. He's back.
So Timothy, we're at the point here where Joel has wrapped up his presentation. And of course, I know that you have a number of questions that you wanted to ask. I, of course, have to hear some commentary on what Joel has mentioned. So, Timothy, the floor is yours to, of course, ask Joel any questions which you might see fit. And let us have the discussion.
Well, I noticed that Joel segued from discussing oil and gas to one of the best pro-PPP speeches I've heard in a long time. Joel tried to distinguish, and I'll start at the end, what he called the National Development Strategy, which was a continuation of the Economic Recovery Program. And for some reason, he attributed all its, first of all, he tried to call that a true policy strategy in contradistinction to the Green State Development Strategy. Well, trust me, I am not going to try to defend the Green State Development Strategy. But I want to point out that there's a big difference between a plan, a policy, and a pipe dream. And when you call something a strategy and you say we want a bridge here and we want a double highway there and we want a pie in the sky and a castle for everybody, that's a pipe dream. And I, speaking for myself, except for the Economic Recovery Program on the Height, which had a definite plan and was implemented in a sensible way, I myself have not seen very much other than pipe dreams from either administration, quite frankly. So I don't want to just let that one lie. When you talk about plans, the Kanji Bridge and the Demerara Harbour Bridge we have now, and the 4-lane Rupert Craig Highway, and the 4-lane Pleasant Road from Lamaha Street to Public Road, those were all projects for development under Burnham, and I am no admirer of Burnham. So I don't think we should try to isolate this, and I don't think we should try to politicize this conversation, because it will lead us up a road that we shouldn't be going. We should be having a discussion about development of electricity. Now, I agree with what Joel said about the need for development of specific areas. He talked about a new Demerara Harbour Bridge. Definitely, we need a new bridge over the Demerara River. He talked about the Suriname connection. Definitely, we need a bridge to Suriname. Brazil Road. We've been talking about the Brazil Road since the 70s. Definitely, we need a road to Brazil. And all of these things will help development and will encourage development and will foster the flow of money, the transfer of money. So all of those are good. I don't see that all of those directly relate back to electrical production through Exxon's involvement in supplying gas to the shore. So I have a reservation about that. Certainly, any development will increase economic consumption, but we're talking dollars and cents. So the first thing we have to identify is what are we getting for the 400 million that we're spending? What profits will this new entity have? And if we're projecting growth in consumption, I agree that may well translate to growth in profit, but we got to be careful how we do it, because I don't see that a road to Brazil is going to be a direct impact on this. And we have to be careful that we understand the electricity sector in Guyana and we understand how it works and understand the dangers of all eggs in one basket. The other danger that I foresee, and I worry about, and I was hoping it would be raised, is the recognition that everyone says, and I'm no expert, but following the trends, it looks like it has some truth in it. I think you will note on the news today, last financial year was Sun's first year recording a loss in decades. Now, that's dangerous, because if the future of oil and gas is not as clear as we may think it is, I don't think we should be too easily making projections 10, 20 years down the road without accommodating that variable. That's a serious variable to think about. We do not know what prices will be like. Another question I will ask concerns Exxon Mobil. My reading of their contractual material does not place any obligation on them to provide gas to us. So they're a commercial entity. I haven't seen in the discussion what the cost will be to us of that gas. I do know that the infrastructure they have already set up, because they're already operating, allows them to, well, they had a breakdown recently, as we all know, but it allows them to re-inject the gas back on the ground as part of the process. If they have that infrastructure up and running again, it will involve a cost to them to adjust that infrastructure to piping it to the shore. Are we assuming that they will be providing that gas for free, or will they be implementing a charge for us? If there's a charge, have we discussed it? Because we know right now there's no contractual obligation to them. Joel mentioned that he saw the initial cost as being maybe 400 million. He was unclear on what we're getting for 400 million, so I won't question him too closely on that. But the suggestion that Exxon will be contributing to that 400 million, I'm not sure that I'm seeing where that's coming from. I don't think Exxon have made such a commitment. I am aware, you're aware, that in the recent debates in Parliament, one of the changes proposed by my good friend Ashni Singh included raising the debt ceiling exponentially. I mean, I was surprised at the extent. Now, the reason you raise your borrowing capacity is because you're planning to borrow. And that is one of the classical signals that send alarms off in my head. Because I had asked on this show previously, I pointed out, government's awarding contracts, we getting roads here and things getting built here and there and everywhere and promises made. Where's the money coming from? And I had asked, is that money going to come from borrowing against projected revenue from oil? That would be worrying, especially given that we have an obligation as to what we do with that revenue. And if you look at other countries like Ghana, for example, where there was a boom, they found oil. The first thing the government did was start borrowing heavily against projected income, anticipating 7% and 10% growth. And when the price of oil dropped, they ran into serious problems. Now, the projects that Joel is talking about, I agree with. We need a Brazil road. We need to expand our Demerara Bridge because the amount of traffic going over there and to develop on the other side of the bridge is important. We need the connection to Suriname. These things will help the economy, but these things will require an initial huge capital injection by the government if the government is doing it. And I am afraid that if the government is now borrowing against anticipated revenue from oil and borrowing heavily, that we are putting all our eggs in one basket and we are risking too much. So that is a different conversation from the gas phenomenon and whether it should be linked to electrical production and whether that's feasible. But it is something I worry about. When we talk about development and we talk about government's involvement in commercial entities and we talk about debt and equity, which is what you were mentioning earlier, I can point you to some issues in partnerships. The first one I know about that I can mention off the top of my head, Electoral Sector Board Incorporated, Irish company, persuaded under the Jagan administration to come in and invest and replace GC, and had such a rough time interacting with the government that eventually they packed up and they left. We do not have a good reputation in our interaction with private investors, and we need to change that. When we decide to go on board in terms of a government-sponsored project, we saw what happened with the Berbice Bridge. It was a necessary project, but it was funded in a way that was improper because it used NIS funds, and NIS is in serious financial trouble. But the majority used NIS funds. They got funds from tried to get funds from New Building Society, and the projections for expansion of growth, which is what Joel is talking about, did not materialize, so that the use of the bridge did not realize the revenue that was expected. And when the bridge had to raise their fees for people using it, as we all know, David Patterson took over because that was a politically unsavory possibility, and took over the bridge, and it became a problem. So I have a difficulty with government getting involved in commercial ventures. I can mention the Skeldon Estate, which is a government-sponsored commercial venture, which failed abysmally. I do not want to know that government is increasing its borrowing so that it can go on harebrained schemes that are not properly thought out. I want to see private investors putting their money where their mouths are. That is what I'm saying. Now, to go back to the first thing that Joel was talking about, he mentioned the cost of $400 million, a huge amount of money, but we're vague on what we're getting for that $400 million. And I don't know what we're getting. Are we getting generation capacity? Because if we're getting generation capacity, we're getting a generation plant that can use that gas. Are you talking about one plant in a location? Here they're talking about IFLOT in a single location like that. Or are you talking about many plants along the coast and in the interior? One of the difficulties with Guyana is it's not Barbados, it's not 12 square miles. And you cannot have a single generation point where you're trying to supply electricity from IFLOT all the way to Berbice, all the way over the Essequibo River, to all the islands in Wikenham, to Kokwani and to Rupununi. So has that been thought out? Or is it that we are just thinking of one single location where gas is delivered, but we haven't thought about the transmission? You see, it's one thing to talk about fuel. The cost of fuel, yes, is high, the GPL pays, but GPL has generation units in Kokwani, over the river, in Essequibo, in Bartica. They're separate. And the reason that's important is because the geographical land space is so huge, you cannot have a single generation capacity. I'm not sure that's been thought out. The other thing that needs to be thought out is that when we talk about the 1,000,000 megawatts that is being used, I haven't seen anyone, and I'm not going to press Joel on this. He may have the answer. I simply don't know. But I haven't seen anyone say if that is what is consumed in Guyana or if that is what is generated in Guyana. And there's a huge difference because the largest problem the GPL has and has had historically is its distribution on this enormous geographical space. So everybody who lives in Georgetown is familiar with the new high wire lines that were run along Lamaha Street, going up the East Coast and going to Berbice. That was to reorganize the distribution system of electricity, those nice high wires. GPL loses nearly 50% of its generation through distribution losses and theft of electricity. So it's an oversimplification to say, oh, we spent 200 million for fuel. We setting up one generating plant in Iflot or wherever we're setting it up, but without thinking about if we're solving the problem where the problem lies. Because you could generate electricity very nicely, but if you're losing 50% in your distribution before it even reaches the household, you have a problem. Now, when we talk about projections for housing, 50,000 a year, I hear. We're population of 700,000. PPP's best innovation has been their housing policy from 1996 coming up to 2014. But there comes a point when that huge demand for housing begins to taper off, it begins to plateau. And with a population of 700,000, I'm not sure we're seeing that kind of new house lots coming on. And the other thing that needs to be mentioned, if you have an understanding of GPL's billing system, it is the large industrial consumers that subsidize the domestic consumers. So you may not be realizing a profit if you're projecting to be giving electricity to households, because the households are subsidized. They are consuming at less than generation cost. There are simply too many variables to make a pronouncement unless an expert looks at all of those variables. And for me, I don't want that expert to be the government, because somebody's got to put their money where their mouth is, and I really don't want the government putting my money where their mouth is, because we have a track record of commercial failure where there's government investment. So I agree with what Joel is saying. Give it a try, facilitate it. See if you can persuade Exxon to make this thing available. See if you can get an investor who will build a generator that can deal with it. But don't put all your eggs in one basket, because as soon as you do that, as soon as you say, if we do this, the whole of Guyana will be supplied, what you've created is a monopoly, which the government must control, because the government cannot relinquish all power generation to a private investor. For me, I would prefer to see 7, 8, 9 independent autonomous generation units. Some wind, some solar, some diesel, and if we can get somebody to use Exxon's flaring, to reduce Exxon's flaring by bringing the gas on, sure, I would like to see that, but I'd like it to be done privately. Confine the government's role to distribution of the electricity. Let GPL be a distribution agency buying generation power at pre-agreed prices from these people who will be coming to invest. So I'm not disagreeing with what Joel is saying, but I'm saying that we cannot draw conclusions with with insufficient information. Not when we talk in those numbers, and not with the government's track record.
Gentlemen, thank you. This, of course, of our discussion. I have quite a bit also that I look forward to commenting on. But at this time, we have to take a commercial break, a very short commercial break. And then when we are back, we will further on the posits which both Timothy and Jonas, Jonas, and Joel Bhagwandin have made here this evening.
AllFromOneSupplier.com is promoting Gaisuku sugar as a way to support Guyana sugar industry. Purchase your Gaisuku sugar from AllFromOneSupplier.com along with your West Indian and American groceries. Purchasing Gaisuku sugar is a good fate gesture to help restore the sugar industry. AllFromOneSupplier.com has free shipping and delivery, and we ship to all states and free deliveries in New York. Log on to allfromonesupplier.com or call 718-551-3292. That's allfromonesupplier.com or 718-551-3292. All From One Supplier is pleased to announce its online shipping for West Indian and American groceries. Order online at allfromonesupplier.com and with free shipping and deliveries to any part of the United States. Save time and energy to shop for all of your West Indian groceries from the safety of your home or office. We carry West Indian products like curry powders, meats and fish, dashing bush, pepper sauce, sodas, and your favorite snacks. All From One Supplier has it all. All From One Supplier fulfills and ships your order directly to you. So visit All From One Supplier today to start shopping or call All From One Supplier at 718-551-3292 to handle all of your West Indian grocery needs. That's All From One Supplier, 718-551-3292. Free shipping, free deliveries, or curbside pickup from allfromonesupplier.com. TravelSpan is now serving Guyana for over 26 years. They offer all airlines such as American, Eastern, Caribbean, and JetBlue. Guyana now has choices, so let TravelSpan compare all airlines and offer you the best fare. And don't forget, TravelSpan now has a shop, ship, and cargo division. So if you cannot travel, then shop and ship your items to TravelSpan. TravelSpan clears your items with customs and also has your items ready for pickup at any one of our offices in Georgetown, Berbice, or West Coast Demerara. Call TravelSpan in New York at 718-845-0437, Georgetown at 227-1701, or Berbice at 337-4287. In New York, 718-845-0437, Georgetown 227-1701, or Berbice 337-4287, and West Coast Demerara at 269-0140. Let TravelSpan book your flights or ship your items.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program where we have had some very interesting positions put forward by Mr. Jonas as well as by Joel this evening here. Of course, we have had some concerns in the public domain, which Joel has sought to respond to. And we have also had some concerns raised here this evening by Mr. Jonas. So I'll just go through a couple of things which I have seen emanating from the discussion and some areas which I would like us to perhaps concentrate a bit on. Joel, you would have made the comment this evening here that the project is of course transformative. And it will do quite a bit of good to the Guyanese economy. But I want to ask, many projects within Guyana and within Guyana's development history have been transformative, but they have come with a significant amount of risk, if not action being put in place to mitigate or to offset the risk. What are some of the risks, Joel, that you have seen with the Gas to Shore project?
Well, some of the risks are contained in the limitation. Of course, I'm not, even though I ignored from the study, which I explained lack of data and the fact that the official work of the government would definitely take that into consideration. The risks are definitely the environmental risk, so we can't discount the environmental risk. You have the financing risk, which is activities main bone of contention as well, how the project would be financed, what level of equity would government be required to put in, which is why in my assumptions that I use 15%, even if it's 20%, that's decent. So there's the financing risk, and you have the political risk, which is the biggest one, right? The political risk is the number one risk that would have stymied most of our development, right? So those are the main risks of the project: financing, environmental, political risks, right?
Okay, thank you very much for that, Joel. So, of course, you've elaborated on many of the benefits which you've seen, and you have alluded to some risks there. So, Timothy, you have of course gone counter to the mood which Joel has proposed here this evening. But what are some of the benefits that you anticipate from a project like this, Timothy, notwithstanding all of what you've raised? What are some of the anticipated benefits you see should the project go forth in its current form?
Okay. Well, you say in its current form, but we don't have a project yet. So let me please pretend in my mind that we find a private investor who's willing to set up a generation plant using Exxon gas. The first thing is that you get more reliable electricity. One of our problems with our aging generation system is that it's unreliable. I see the environmental risk, and that needs to be dealt with. To me, that's the most important thing to be dealt with, because the fact of the matter is that we do not have the infrastructure or the wherewithal to deal with any disaster, to deal with any environmental accident. We don't have the personnel, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the money. So for me, that's the most important thing. But once it's up and running, I would like to see it in a location like IFLOT, or a location that is not central, because I think it's time that we try to decentralize. Everything's in Georgetown. We got generation in Gardner Eden, generation in Kingston, we got generation right over the road, over the river in Versailles. I think that everything is too close and there needs to be some decentralization. So it would create employment opportunities further afield. I think that's important. I think that it can then be a dedicated generation capacity in an area that can create its own industrial site, its own industrial estate. What I would like to see is industrial estates that are coming up in agricultural areas. One of the problems we have is that places like Pomeroon, places like Bushlot, grow so much and they do not have a means of food preservation. They do not have a means to can their food, the agricultural products. They do not have a means to process it in any way. All of that is electrical based. And those are areas where electricity has always been unreliable. They cannot develop without it. And their solution, which is to bring the raw produce to town along our hopeless transportation routes, doesn't solve the problem. So for me, it would be useful to decentralize so that industrial sites are created out of Georgetown in the middle of those agricultural areas where they are needed. I would like to see that happening very much.
So, Timothy, I know you said that we're not sure what we're getting in this regard, but my understanding of what is in the public domain is that for somewhere around the fee of between 400 to 500 million that we will be getting from a Wales estate as being the area where the natural gas, the shore facility, is to be piped on shore. So I think that is what we understand within the public sphere. So there certainly seems to be, in light of that, as in conjunction with the new Demerara Harbour Bridge and other housing developments, plans for Region 3, and of course ensuring that we have broader economic development and not just concentrated within the current urban space. I also would have heard this evening that we would have discussed the raising of the debt ceiling in Parliament. Secondly, just as a second point, my understanding of the expansion of this debt ceiling, the last time the debt ceiling was adjusted in Guyana was 1991 by a gazetted order through former Minister of Finance, Kara Greenwich. So when this ceiling is adjusted, when one looks at the GDP, you end up with a debt to GDP limit of about 60%, which of course we know is for those viewers who are looking on, the amount of debt relative to the output which the economy has. And the IMF usually identifies for a matter of macro stability and to ensure that your economy does not overheat and become unstable, etc. They usually identify 60% as being a threshold. So I don't see that being too much of an issue at this point, simply because of our expanding output. But one also has to take into context what has happened historically in the recent past in Guyana and the reason for the raising of that debt ceiling. My understanding and being involved in public finance in Guyana, I can tell you that a number of debts were contracted by government, which were not brought onto the books of government. So you had parastatal agencies, which are state-owned enterprises, contracting debt. You had government giving guarantees of certain types of debt, which all of this, if we take it into consideration, they're either liabilities to the government, or they can become liabilities to the government, and they are not being counted in the national debt. And of course, we know what happened with the overdraft facility, and that point has been ventilated in the public domain. So I think that point also on bringing the debts onto the books of Guyana, that is a point which it's something which in my understanding of what is being done is that is necessary, because should that debt be brought onto the books of government, it will violate what we currently have as the ceiling, which is somewhere about 400 billion Guyana dollars, or about 2 billion US dollars as being the public external debt. So, you know, I've heard some very interesting positions here this evening, and I do want us to begin to wind down the conversation. I will give a couple of remarks in closing, but I just want to ask both Joel and Timothy, do you think, and you can take this one after the other, Joel first, Timothy second, do you think that Guyana has enough public transparency and accountability mechanisms, institutions, and infrastructure in place to be able to handle a massive project like this? And Joel, let's just put aside for the moment, you know, which party is in office, etc. We're speaking here about the institutions and the infrastructure in place from a wider context, without, you know, putting a party in place, etc. Do you think that we have the infrastructure and the institutions to handle massive projects such as the gas to shore? And if not, what can we do to improve directly in the short term?
Richard, is that my only question? Because the question is more suited for Timothy, because it is within his sphere of expertise. But nonetheless, I will give it a go. Do we have enough institution? And you're emphasizing transparency. We have an institutional, if I could use the term, institutional deficit. Do we have adequate institution to allow for transparency and to deal with these scale of investments? I don't think so. And here I could only refer to His Excellency himself, who in a recent Globespan forum acknowledged that, and which was carried in the press today as well, acknowledged that isn't sufficient institution. Those institutions that exist has to be strengthened. So the fact that His Excellency has acknowledged that very fact, I think that is a good step to begin with. So we can only watch it unfold as he stands to his words in that regard. I know Timothy might have a lot more to say in that, but Richard, permit me, given that I don't have much to say, I know Timothy is going to expound on that more than me. I'm trying to wriggle out of the question because I really can't contribute much to it. But I want to comment on a few things as I have the opportunity to make up for that deficit in my earlier contribution on a few things that Timothy said. And that is, one, he said that with regards to the presentation I made, of course, he said that we don't know how the road linking Brazil, for example, is. He can't see the relationship. I'm paraphrasing Timothy. The relationship of the gas to show bringing benefits. Now, the caveat of the whole project is that the general idea, the basic idea is that it's going to reduce the cost of energy. And let's take, what does this road mean? It means, first of all, the road connecting Brazil and Guyana, the feasibility of that road is dependent on a deep water harbor. All right? Because the whole point of it is so that Brazil could move their goods through Guyana. So opening up a road of that magnitude would mean you're opening up lands, more lands on the highway along that geographic location or that district. Opening up more lands, it means you're going to have more lands for industrial activities. You're going to have more land for commercial activities, agriculture activities. What are you going to do? How do you convert these lands into industrialized activities? It means you need cheap, low cost of energy. The reason why we can't compete with Trinidad, when we pay 25-30 cents a kilowatt US for energy, Trinidad is probably 90% driven by natural gas, their energy mix, and so their average cost is about 11 or 8 cents a kilowatt. So this is how it ties in. I want to make another comment, Richard, permit me, with Berbice, for example, the Berbice bridge model, and Timothy talks about he has an issue with, which is a valid issue. I can understand where Timothy is coming from. Government, because it has failed in the past, historically, government are not good at running enterprises. We have seen what happened with GNCB and so on. Right? Now, I can understand Timothy's perspective in that regard. But at the same time, how do you mobilize private investors? How do you get private investors to come here? So more than economic policies, more than having the right mix of economic policies, you need investors' confidence. Now, economic policies alone is not enough to stimulate investors' confidence. Investors' confidence depends on many other things. Depends on, we could talk about security, depends on political stability. It depends on a country having a direction. And I'll tell you, for example, I have a consulting firm, a private consulting firm, where the work that I do is a lot of investment proposals for investors. And I can tell you, from August 2nd to now, through my consulting firm alone, I have processed investment proposals to the tune of 400 million US. 400 million US. Now that's just my firm alone. We didn't talk about other firms. We didn't talk about other consultants. That's just me alone. All right? That is because of confidence. Let's backpedal to Berbice Bridge, the genesis of the Berbice Bridge and the Marriott. The feasibility of the Berbice Bridge was dependent on the development that needed to take place in that region. For example, the deepwater port. But nothing has happened, and again, it comes back to the political economy. See how the political economy is intertwined in all of this? As a result of stymieing development, we should have done have the deepwater port so long, which would have created so much of commerce and other opening up opportunities, the bridge across the Berbice River and all of that. And so in the long term, that bridge, we could have reduced the costs and the investments could have been recovered. But those things didn't happen. People go away. And then in 2015, we killed the one thing that was keeping the community sugar, killed that too. So obviously the bridge is going to end up in financial problems. A facility like the Marriott if private investors are not coming, and we know that the country need the facilities, if we didn't have the national stadium, for example, we're not going to host CPL. As a result of having a national stadium of the national class, we can host CPL and these other international sports. CPL alone brings in more than $1 million US in economy. Think of the taxi operators who work at the airport. Think of the bar operators. Think about the entertainment complex, the entertainment industry. Think about the hotel industry. And so all these projects, the feasibility of them depends on the other. You can't build a Marriott and not expand the airport. So I use this opportunity. I hijacked this opportunity from you, Richard, by diverting from your question because I don't have a proper answer to give you on that question other than to rely on what the president himself says. But they're all connected. And there are three main problems of Guyana development constraining this development. That is the cost of energy. We have an infrastructure deficit. We have a human capital deficit. Now we need to reverse those. We need to address our human capital deficit. We need to address our infrastructure deficit. And we need to resolve our energy problem. Yes, I agree wholeheartedly with the technicalities that Timothy raised in his articulations about the technical aspects that need to be considered in the project of itself. Yes, those are important considerations. I'm not discounting that, right? So thank you for that, and sorry, Richard, for running away with you. You already spoke of the debt ceiling, so I was going to comment on the debt ceiling as well. So I'm not going to comment on that.
Well, Joel, I'm accustomed anytime having you on a discourse to permit you some latitude to express yourself because one, the interconnectedness of everything that you speak about, but two, also to allow you to ventilate your position in a manner that's suitable. But Timothy, I do have a few things I want to say also. But Timothy, go ahead. Let me just bring it back to where we were. It's on the matter of public transparency and accountability. Do you think we have the infrastructure, the institutions in place? And if you believe that we don't, what can we do in the short term to deal with that?
Richard, that is the question. And I'm glad you raised it because I was going to jump in and volunteer it. And allow me, please, to express my regard because you did raise it. However, after you raised it, Joel did a bit of scattershot and discussed a lot of things that I think need answering. So I don't know how much time you're going to give me, but I would like to deal with the scattershot and I would like to answer your question too, because I think your question is the central important question that all of Guyana needs to think about. I know your political persuasion, and yet with your political persuasion, you have asked me you have asked the question that any patriot in Guyana must ask, because whether it's your people in government or the other people in government, you need your systems to make sure that there is transparency and integrity. We have had corruption through and through our government, our successive governments. And I don't think even Joel will deny that. And the reason we've had such corruption is that there hasn't been transparency. I believe, and I still believe, although my hope is beginning to wilt because I'm seeing bad signs, that President Ali really wants to leave a good legacy. But the reality is that there have been no systemic changes to create transparency, to mandate transparency. We remember when Winston Jordan pretended that there was no signing bonus, a pitiful sum of $18 million hiding from a country. The fact that a minister can do that is dangerous, but we see it now. Bishop Wanegel the other day tried to defend the award of a road building contract to someone who had no prior experience. We've seen the Minister of Agriculture hiding the issue of 2 trawler licenses. These are not things that we should allow to get away Whether you support the government or not, they are not acceptable. And the system needs to be changed so that transparency exists in every corridor of power, every corridor of decision making. Richard, I've said it over and over, and people don't like to hear it. There can only be transparency when you put opposition members on the boards. I'm sorry, there's no other way around it. Because it is only when the opposition members watch when you are trying to award a contract, when you are awarding a trawler license, or when you are awarding a road building contract. It is only then that you have transparency because you have somebody who will blow the whistle. Unless you do that, and unless you do that as a system, not as a matter of grace, you will not have transparency and you will continue to have the problems that we are seeing, that we have hard experience of, and that we are seeing may possibly be arising again. I am very worried about it. So for me as a system, you got to put your enemy in the boardroom, so that he sees what's happening and he can scrutinize it and can comment on it. The reason the parliamentary committee works, the oversight committee that Patterson hopefully will not be chairman of for much longer, is because both sides are there and both sides get to quarrel with each other. One side will lose because government has majority in parliament, well and good, but at least both sides are there to scrutinize. And unless you have that scrutiny in NISIL, unless you have that scrutiny in GPL, in Gaiwa, where large contracts are awarded, you will have secret deals and you will have corruption and you will have more fishing trawlers. Now, a couple of things that Joel said that I would like to get into, please, and a couple of things you said. You talked about the 60% debt equity. You are basing that figure on income that we have from oil. That has affected your percentage. And the reason that that is uncertain and dangerous, and I don't like to rely on it, is because we cannot project what oil prices will be like in the future. So I think it is a bit of a gloss to just say 60%, because we got nice prices now, when it might not be 60% in the future. And oil is such a large aspect of what the economy is going to be like in the future. I think there needs to be a more careful assessment of that.
I will respond to Timothy when I'm giving my closing remarks.
Okay. The other thing I'd like to mention, Joel treats government investment as if it's a necessity. He says, how else do you do it? But I'd like to give you some examples. At the time when Guyana had the poorest track record for how it treated foreign investors, and let me say this to you as well, foreign investment isn't just about whether you got electricity. It's about the confidence you have that the government will keep its promise. If you're a foreign investor and you know that government has a good reputation for keeping its promise to you, you will invest. You will deal with the poor electricity, you will deal with the poor infrastructure, you will count your pennies, and you will make your investment. But if the government has a poor reputation, as unfortunately our government does, for keeping its contracts, we brokered a terrible contract with ExxonMobil. But what are we doing? We are giving a knee-jerk reaction that we got to change this and change that and throw away the contract. That is not what a foreign investor wants to hear. So to give you examples of foreign investment in Guyana, when we were at our lowest ebb in terms of investor confidence, when we had the worst reputation in the world, Burama, 1991, under Hoyt, lovely investment. They came, started making plywood, started developing the timber industry. They left when this government, when the prior government unilaterally changed their timber concession arrangement. Again, we have destroyed our reputation for investors because we unilaterally did that. They walked out. GT&T came in, ATN under Hoyt in 1991, transformed our telephone system. Oh my, the best thing that happened under Hoyt, provided over 1,000 employees, gave us huge revenue and royalties in gold in terms of exports. They had environmental issues, all wasn't perfect, but that was transformative at the time. And it was a private investor who didn't use our electricity, who went in the interior, did their own thing. The government, under how it sold shares in GRL and the nationally owned banks, by Shanlin, closed down by a government who didn't like what Bai Shanlin were doing and therefore broke its contract. We have to honor our contracts with the foreign investors, and we have to ensure that our reputation is improved, because you can talk all day, but unless you act, unless your reputation is reflected in your acts, not in spiel, not in just words. So I would like to put that out, that the foreign investors are there once they can have confidence. That's something Lee Kuan Yew taught us 40 years ago. Yeah, Richard. I'm done.
Thank you, Timothy. Let me just say on the point of the debt ceiling and so on. This is something where we really have to have a full elaboration or a full discussion on something of this sort. There is a difference between the price of oil, the revenue that it accrues to government as a result of the price of oil. That is a stream for government, and the output or the economic sector of the particular, which we are considering here as oil and gas, and its impact on GDP. So where you may have revenue accruing to government being diminished as a result of a low price environment, you will still have, even in a low price environment, a certain level of economic activity which will be counted into the GDP. So it's two distinct things in terms of the revenue, government revenue, and economic output. And price and the low price environment tends to affect the government revenue, or the revenue which will accrue from oil and gas, greater than it will economic output. So this is why I don't find, and if we are taking into consideration what we have right now as our GDP, and the raising of that debt ceiling only brings it to 60%, consider within the medium term of about 5 years where that will be. In my view, however, I don't think that Guyana needs, I think Guyana needs to move away from a statutory or a nominal debt ceiling, which means that it should move away from a cap as a number of the 400 billion, of the $2 billion US dollars, and it should move towards what is called a flexible debt to GDP ratio, which is a percentage of the GDP, so that figure floats as the year goes along, and give it a floor where it should not go below. But that is a matter for a public finance discussion. So, gentlemen, thank you so much this evening for your positions and advancing what you have put forward here. We are at 9:30, and this discussion, of course, has taken us into some realms which perhaps we have not anticipated, or we did not anticipate at the beginning. I want to say something on the matter of the gas to shore project before you gentlemen give closing remarks, is that it is I find in Guyana we discuss many issues from a financial perspective and a financial viability perspective, perhaps because we have many persons who are trained in private finance and who are trained in matters related to understanding a private venture, and they don't seem to grasp the economic aspect of it, which is a broader development context. Let us take, for example, the sugar industry. Financial decision was made to close it based on the fact that revenues were not surpassing expenditure, and therefore it was in a financial deficit annually. But look at the broader economic benefit, though that ought to be taken into consideration. The other one where we made where we have taken that discussion in a very narrow scope is on the project of a refinery in Guyana, an oil refinery, where the project has also been taken in a narrow dollars and cents scope and viewing it from financial lens, not just from the broader economic lens and the implications which it has in terms of spurring or catalyzing growth. Now, for me, the same issues which have been raised and ventilated regarding the refinery are the same issues which I see being raised here and being used as the point upon which to buttress or to rebut rather the gas to shore project. Once again, for example, Tom, the gentleman who was the director from the Institute of Energy Economics, he is a financial, he's taken a financial analytical perspective and not an economic analytical perspective. And it is important because when you deal in government and you deal in public policy, you ought not to only look at things in dollars and cents. There is the broader context which one has to take into place. So I want to say some of the same issues which I saw emanating from the refinery are some of the same issues that we can have a discussion on here. The gas to shore project, irrespective, let us take the worst case scenario and say that it is going to work at a financial loss. It brings certain broader development issues into play. For example, the lower energy costs and capitalizing the manufacturing sector and other economic sectors in Guyana. It brings Guyana to a position of energy security where it is no longer reliant on external partners or external players for the supply of a quantum of its or a core set of its energy consumption, which of course that with it brings its own unique international and geopolitical considerations. The other element is that even if it runs at a financial loss, I believe that there are certain, from a national perspective, looking at Guyana on the global scale, there are certain strategic repositioning benefits that it brings for Guyana. For example, perhaps as a hub for energy and energy development within the Caribbean and really moving us as a leader in the global political economy and particularly in the Western Hemisphere. So I want to say that when we examine these projects, we not only ought to look at it in dollars and cents, we not only need to look at it from a financial perspective, but I think when people are looking at projects in Guyana, particularly large transformative projects, we ought to view it with a lens where we look at the broader economic benefit, and the cost benefit analysis ought not only to be revenue and expenditure, but it ought to be what is the implication for the wider economy as well as the social welfare. With those few words being said, I would like to invite firstly Joel and then Timothy to provide the closing remarks before we end this evening's discussion.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. First of all, Timothy, I think the next time you and I and myself, you and Richard on a Globespan forum, we need more time because it's a really beautiful discussion. So before I get into my closing remarks, let me take a minute quickly to say a few things that will lead to my closing remarks. The examples you have given, Timothy, about investors' confidence using the Barama and the OMI and so forth. You see, as a lawyer, and you are a prolific lawyer in your field, you would know that an issue has many variables. There are many other factors. Those are not the only factors, while we must not discount them, that affects investors' confidence. So while those are valid observations with regards to investors' confidence, you have also the issue where governments would want to attract investment in a particular sector. And if investors don't have the confidence in that particular sector, then sometimes it is necessary for government to do the bold thing to mobilize that resource, mobilize investors and get on board with that, with the intent at a later date to liquidate that investment. Now, let's not elaborate too much on that. I just want to say that, but I want to comment a little bit as well on the debt ceiling in addition to what Richard said, and then I'll conclude quickly. The thing is, you see, people are confusing, and it is unfortunate that the former finance minister, the way he interpreted when I read his comments, is as though the finance minister, the government will go and max out this debt ceiling right away. Now, my view differs a little bit from Richard in terms of removing the ceiling. I don't necessarily agree with removing the ceiling. I think the ceiling is a good macro stability mechanism, because if you remove it, then the government could decide to raise it to anyhow. So it's a good
Let me just.
framework to keep.
I don't want for it to be said that I am advocating for the removal of the debt ceiling. I'm advocating for the removal of a nominal debt ceiling to a percentage ceiling, one which is not hinged on an amount, for example, $400 billion, but rather as a percentage of GDP. Many of the advanced countries who have moved, or emerging economies move this way.
Okay, but you keep the ceiling. You keep a ceiling. But that's inconsequential to what I want to say about it. That's just a matter of technicality. But what I want to say about it, we have to understand what is GDP, what GDP measures. GDP measures expenditure. It measures investment, which includes local and foreign investment in the country, foreign direct investment. It measures household expenditure. It measures government spending, and it also measures your net exports, or captures your net exports, or your trade balance. That is what GDP measures. How much, to what extent expenditure in these categories have increased in the year. Now, Timothy said that the ceiling is based on projected revenue. Not necessarily, right? When you look at the 30% increase, for example, yes, you would see that in the narrative, it is driven by oil and gas activities, but that is not oil and gas revenue. And let me show you where the activities are. As a result of what is taking place offshore, that operation requires support goods and services. You see, farmers are getting contract to supply produce. They need other health and safety equipment. They need warehousing, storage, and all these other infrastructure. Now look at our import, for example. That is where you would see import pre-oil average $2 billion a year. It was less than $2 billion and average about $2 billion. You know where import jumped to in 2020? 3 billion. That's 1 billion increase. That is where the GDP come from. Oil and gas related investment in the supply chain, in the midstream sector to service it, right? So it's as a result of projected revenues. It is as a result of investments taking place in the economy. So when you look at the level at which government spending would increase in these transformational projects, and the level of private investments and foreign direct investments, that is the basis upon which GDP is projected to grow. Of course, yes, oil is in that equation because the oil revenues will be used to fund expenditure. So we wouldn't spend all of it. All right, but that is not the basis. So I wanted to say that much. The second thing is, it doesn't mean that the government would max out all of it. It means this is where the level of the debt ceiling needs to be raised, given the trajectory of the rate at which the economy would expand for the next decade. All right. So as GDP increases proportionately, your debt would increase. And I have some numbers which I don't want to get too technical now into my closing remarks, and I'm going to read my original closing remarks for my presentation, which I didn't get to read. So this is it. For too long, Guyana has been an underdeveloped country, and it would be good for everyone to embrace this strategy and contribute their skills and expertise in finding solutions to advance this very ambitious, relevant, and much needed development path for the country. The development strategy for the country by the current regime was developed over 25 years ago, and it remains relevant today simply because the geographical landscape of Guyana has not changed and the country's development was stymied for many years. The contextual analysis essentially concludes that the gas to shore project is deemed to be economically and financially viable and will have less than 5% or virtually zero impact on the country's public debt, contrary to the views of other proponents who believe that this will lead to a debt trap. Richard, Rambarran, and Timothy, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be on this panel here with you, esteemed gentlemen, and of course, Timothy.
Thank you, Joel. Timothy?
Thanks, Richard. I see that Joel made the same point you made, that oil revenue isn't necessarily economic, reflected in the overall economic figures. I think some Trinis might disagree with you because, as you yourself have said, everything ties in. So in Trinidad, their wonderful fertilizer industry, which was based on oil products and everything else, once the oil began to decline, everything else declines. It's all tied in. And you can't, with one hand, in one breath, say, oh, one isn't related to the other. But then in the next breath, say, all of these things are interconnected. They're interconnected, of course. So I would like to make that point. Now, I see Joel in his closing remarks still held to the thrust that this thing is financially viable and is going to make money. Richard, I saw that you moved away from that. And you made the point, which I think is a good point, that even if something isn't going to make money, if it provides infrastructural development so as to foster economic growth in some other way, then as a social issue, it is important. You use Gaisuko as an example. I'm going to get back to Gaisuko. I agree with that point, but we are talking a 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe even 800 million US dollar investment in something that we don't know about. If you want cheap electricity, subsidize what we got now. Use your oil revenue and subsidize what we got now. Create the infrastructure that way. Buy generators and expand. But if you are going to try to justify that huge, not evolutionary, but revolutionary transformative system, it either got to be viable or not. And if it's not viable, you gotta you would be making much more sense to subsidize what you have and expand what you have. Joel talked about the inapplicability of my examples, Baramo and the others. But each of those provided employment, each of those provided exports and therefore royalty. But I'll give you some electricity specific examples. A few years ago, a Bayesian company retained me. They were going to set up a generation plant on the Linden Highway using timber byproducts to burn and generate electricity. They were going to spend their own money to do this. Once they set up, they were going to sell electricity to the GPL grid, and GPL turned them down. Now, this is a perfect example of a private investor willing to put his money where his mouth is, guarantee a price per megawatt, and supply a specific amount of electricity. The reason he was turned down was not to benefit the country, but because of the tendency of our leaders to try to centralize power and not to allow anybody else to have power. There's another company that came from the Middle East that wanted to set up a wind farm in Berbice. Again, spoke to me. Again, GPL pretended that they could not deal with that because they said the laws didn't permit it, which was total nonsense. But these are private investors that are coming to provide the same electricity service, to expand generation capacity, to give guaranteed prices. Why do we need government involvement? I'm giving you specific examples of private investors who are willing to come to do this. That is how it needs to be done. We saw in the papers, Giffland wanted to sell generation electricity power to GPL grid. Again, problems. So that's what we need to do. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Were you involved in that one too?
No.
In the GPL one? Or were you involved, Timothy, in the GPL one? Or are you involved in the Giffland one? Sorry, were you involved in the Giffland one?
No, I'm not directly involved in that. I read about it in the papers, just like you, Richard.
Okay, because I was going to say very tongue-in-cheek, Timothy, that you seem to be the common denominator. Oh, he's gone. But he seems to be the common denominator for when these projects the way that they're supposed to go. Timothy, I saw you left us there for a bit, but I was going to say very tongue in cheek that you seem to be the common denominator for when these projects are not going the way that they're supposed to go. So, yeah.
Well, I could tell you that when the Irish came to invest and buy over GEC, I was with them from 1999. So maybe that's another example.
All right, yeah.
Richard, I think you're on mute.
That might be a good thing, Joel. Don't tell him.
Yeah, I was on mute there. Gentlemen, I just want to thank you very much here this evening. We're running into 2 hours. And I often say I've been in some of these discussions, not Globespan, but some other platforms for almost 2.5 hours and so on. And the time just never is enough. No limited amount of time in the context of a couple of hours can ever really do full justification to the matters at hand. I can go on and on here this evening and egg the discussion on also for quite some time because I do disagree with Timothy and subsidizing and keeping fossil fuel and all of that. And I can go
Especially,
quite a bit in depth on that. But
Oh,
gentlemen,
I'm not an advocate of subsidization at all. But you had said that even if it's operating at a loss, we should still do it. That's called subsidization.
let us let us leave this discussion for another round of Globespan.
we gotta do a part two, Rich.
Yeah, actually we
If
can
you allow
perhaps
me and
discuss
Timothy, we're gonna go whole night till tomorrow.
Yeah, I do have all the notes here. So viewers and listeners, thank you very much for tuning in to us this evening. I think we have had quite an extensive discussion on some matters which are of course pertinent to Guyana and Guyana's development. We've not always stuck to gas to shore here this evening, but of course that is the nature of when you deal with massive transformational projects within a development context. So viewers and listeners, thank you very, very much for the discussion. I just want to leave with you. I saw in the chat box that some discussion was being had about the difference between gross domestic product and whether we should be considering gross domestic product or gross national income. So I think as a matter of research, viewers and listeners, you can perhaps do some Googling tonight when you're laying in your bed with your cell phone and begin to think about some of these matters within Guyana's context and which measure we should actually be talking about. So thank you very much, Joel and Timothy. Good evening all.
Thank you. Joel, it was a pleasure. Nice talking with you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Same